All right, well, good evening, everybody. I think we'll make a start on this as we're just over the official starting time. Welcome to this evening's event. My name's Anthony Isaacs. I'm the chair of the Friends of Belsize Community Library. For any of you who don't know, the library, which is in a purpose-built Grade 2 listed building in Belsize Park, has been managed by the Winch, a local charity for disadvantaged children, since Camden Council relinquished control in 2012. The Friends aim to publicise and support the library in part by putting on monthly talks. These have been held on Zoom now for getting on for a year and a half, actually, though we do hope to return to the library soon. We don't make any charge for attendance at the Zoom sessions, but as the library has no regular statutory funding, we would ask those attending the meeting who are able to do so to make a small donation, if they feel so inclined, to make regular donations to the library. I put the link for making the donations into the chat box if you have a look at that. And if you go onto the library section of the Winch's website, you'll be able to find out how to become a regular donor. Having said that, I'm delighted to welcome tonight's speaker, who is well known, I think, to several of you already, Neil Titley, who has made a bit of a career of presenting Oscar Wilde to the public over several decades, and will tell us a bit more about how he got started on that. He's performed this all over the world, and has written about Oscar Wilde, and in addition is a fairly regular contributor to the Camden New Journal, where he writes about Victorians with connections to Camden. I just rushed out to get my copy tonight, just in case he was in there. He isn't, so haven't missed anything there, but I'm sure there'll be something else coming along soon. So having said that, Neil will talk to us about for 45 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. So over to you, Neil.
Right, well, thanks very much indeed. I'm going off screen myself at the moment to get at my notes and script. Right, well, as you said, Anthony, thanks very much. And it's going to be about 45 minutes long. There's going to be an interjection in the middle to talk about jail conditions in the 1890s. And then we've got about 15 minutes for questions, hopefully. Right, now, I have been involved with Oscar Wilde for over 40 years, since I set out to portray him in a solo show at the Edinburgh Festival in 1979. Tonight, I'd like to read some of the passages from that show and to give you some idea of how I approach the subject. Oscar, to me, was a rebel whose weapon was laughter, an intellectual to whom pedantry was anathema, a man of conspicuous kindness who was capable of annihilating his opponents in a sentence, a sage who declared that most people died of creeping common sense, an amiably boozy, overweight, tragic hero who flew too near the sun, crashed to his ruin, and then on his deathbed joked about the wallpaper. He was a Greek tragedy made flesh. Now, for anybody entirely new to Oscar or who's forgotten the details, this is a very brief timeline of his life. Okay, in 1854, he was born in Dublin, Ireland. He went to Trinity College, Dublin in 1871 and to Magdalen College, Oxford in 1874. He moved to London in 1879 and carried out a famous lecture tour of the USA and Canada in 1882. In 1884, he married a Dublin girl, Constance Mary Lloyd, and moved into Tite Street in Chelsea, London. Over the next 2 years, his two sons, Cyril and Vivian, were born. In 1890, he published his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. In 1892, he had a great success with his play, Lady Windermere's Fan, and in 1893, he had another triumph with A Woman of No Importance. 1895 was the defining year of his life. It started brilliantly with the opening nights of An Ideal Husband, and then his masterpiece, The Importance of Being Earnest. But then followed the failure of a libel case against the Marquis of Queensberry. Wilde was arrested, convicted on homosexual charges, and sentenced to 2 years in prison. In 1897, he wrote his famous letter from prison called De Profundis. In May, he was released from prison and left England forever. He settled first near Dieppe and then moved to Paris. In 1898, his poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, was published in England. In April 1898, his wife Constance died in Italy. In 1900, Wilde himself died, aged 46, at the Hotel d'Alsace in Paris. Right, well, those are the bare bones of his life, but I'd like to give you a flavour of what his company might have been like. The time is 1898. The place, a cafe table in Paris. Oscar Wilde is sipping wine, yawning and wondering how to pay the bar bill. August in Paris gives one such a sense of desolation, don't you think? All my friends are in Trouville, and most of my enemies are in Deauville. Paris is utterly empty. Even the criminal classes have gone to the seaside, and the gendarmes yawn and regret their enforced idleness. Giving wrong directions to the English tourists is the only thing that consoles them. I saw the Duchess of Swindon on the Rue Rivoli last week. She did not see me. I would not have liked to have embarrassed her. She is such a dear lady. I knew her well in London before my trouble. She told me once that she had been married for an eternity. I believe it is in fact 10 years, but then 10 years with the Duke must seem like eternity, with time thrown in. But she was always delightful, in stark contrast to her mother, the Dowager Duchess. Now, the Dowager's capacity for family affection was quite extraordinary. When her third husband died, her hair turned quite gold with grief. Indeed, she was a peacock in everything, except perhaps beauty. Great heavens, how one wishes for a little money. This last week at the Terminus Hotel, an apt name, my bill has been left every night by my bedside table, and a fresh copy brought up with my croissant in the morning. You can imagine the state of my nerves. The French have not yet realized that the basis for all civilization is unlimited credit. Empires fall only when they have to pay their bills. At that moment, the barbarians arrive. Still, I suppose it is only by not paying one's bills that one can hope to live in the memory of the commercial classes. I have been driven to desperate measures in order to survive recently. Last month, I accepted an invitation to stay in Switzerland with Harold Meller, a rather dreadful combination. Now, Meller is the most extraordinary man. He has a face like a long, dripping candle. I don't think that he possesses a single redeeming vice, and although he has no enemies, he is thoroughly disliked by all his friends. He carries out the traditions of the ancient misers. If I asked him to loan me 5 francs, he would grow yellow and take to his bed. He is loud in his complaints about being overcharged for the wine. He drones on and on about it at all the meals and will not have it drunk. He serves instead Swiss beer. In the evenings, he reads the Times or sleeps, both audibly. As for Switzerland, well, its chastity got on my nerves. Not that one was really tempted. The Swiss look as if they had been carved out of turnips. Their cattle have more expression. Switzerland has produced nothing except theologians and waiters. One of their very few innovations has been the creation of the finishing school. Now, there they have to tolerate people so fascinatingly unreasonable as to attempt to finish in another country what they could not begin in their own. However, I simply had to leave eventually. I could stand it no longer. Oh, money, money, money. I have made some money from writing. Someone tried to commission me to write a biography of Lord Macaulay, I believe it was, but I loathe biographies. I read one on Byron last week. It was simply detestable. Just the sort of biography that Guildenstern would have written about Hamlet. We used to canonize our heroes, now we vulgarize them. Biographers, those second-rate literati who arrive with the Undertaker, the body snatchers of literature. The dust is given to one, the ashes to another, and the soul is entirely out of their reach. I once did earn quite a lot of money as a reviewer of books. Not for long, I freely admit. My first editor seemed to consider that my reviews to be a little too acerbic. I remember writing about one of Charles Dickens's books. One would need a heart of stone not to laugh at the death of little Nell. I remember that distinctly rubbed a nerve end of middle Victorian sensibilities. There are two ways of disliking poetry. One is to dislike it, and the other is to read Alexander Pope. My relationship with this editor ended rather abruptly. He was a rather bad poet who wished to become poet laureate and kept complaining long and loud and vigorously that there was a conspiracy of silence against him. My advice to him was to join it. My next series of reviews were for a rather less exalted magazine, where I was the receiver of practically every publication in existence, deluged by the debris of the middle-class mind. One book remains embedded in my brain as particularly awful. My review contained the following. This book has taken 4 people to write it, and even to read it requires assistance. Still, one should not be too hard on the English novel. It is, after all, the only relaxation of the intellectually unemployed. As far as my own works are concerned, of course, ideal criticism consists of unqualified approval. But I suppose I really must disapprove of critics in the end. If a play is easy to understand, an explanation is unnecessary. And if a man's work is totally incomprehensible, an explanation can be cruelly embarrassing. I am informed that all drama critics can be bought. However, I must say that, judging by their appearance, they really can't be very expensive. They usually emerge like Caliban from the mire of journalism. In the old days, men had the rack. Now they have the press. It was a fateful day when the public discovered that the pen was mightier than the paving stone. For behind every barricade, there may be much that is noble and heroic. But what is there behind the leading article and that curiously decorative object, the conscience of the editor, except prejudice, stupidity, cant, and twaddle? Yet these 4 are joined together to form a new authority, justifying their existence by the great Darwinian principle of the survival of the vulgarist. They chronicle with degrading avidity the sins of the second rate, and with all the conscientiousness of the illiterate, give us accurate and prosaic details of the doings of people of absolutely no interest whatsoever. Instead of monopolizing the seat of judgment, journalism should be apologizing in the dock. Their approach to art is simply hilarious. They try hard to induce the public to judge a sculptor, for instance, not by his statues, but by the way he treats his wife, a poet by his ties, and the painter by the amount of his income. There again, the English artist and the English critic. Great heavens, mediocrity bellowing to mediocrity. I once met one of the Royal Academy painters, the RAs. In fact, there were several standing around at the time, disguised as artists. Anyway, this particular man had that curious mixture of bad painting and good intentions that always mark a man down as a representative British artist. I asked him whether his celebrated picture of Waiting for the Last Omnibus or Spring Day at Parker and Dobson's was all really done by hand. He replied rather coldly that it was. But it seems to me that the only artistic process with which the RAs are thoroughly familiar is that of varnishing. Still, some are passable. If they have not exactly opened the eyes of the blind, they have at least given great encouragement to the short-sighted. Nothing sums up the English artist better than comparison to the French. Now in France, every bourgeois wishes to become an artist, but in England, every artist wishes to become a bourgeois. The English really do not think. Maybe they are correct, who knows? Thinking is the most unhealthy thing in the world, and people die of it just as they die of any other disease. Fortunately, in this country, at any rate, thought is not catching. But I am afraid that we are beginning to become over-educated. Everybody who is incapable of learning has taken to teaching. It may well be that education is an admirable thing, but I do think it is as well to remember from time to time that nothing worth knowing can be taught. Did Christ teach his disciples? I wonder. When Narcissus died, the flowers of the field were stricken with grief and begged the river for drops of water that they might mourn for him. If all my drops of water were tears, replied the river, I would not have enough to weep for Narcissus. I loved him. Well, how could you help loving Narcissus, replied the flowers. He was so beautiful. Was he beautiful? Asked the river. Well, who should know that better than yourself, said the flowers, for every day, lying on your bank, he mirrored his beauty in your waters. I loved him, murmured the river, because when he hung over me, I saw the reflection of my own beauty in his eyes. I spoke a moment ago about my desire for money. I would like to go into that further. Now, of course, I wish for more money. Very few men more so, for lack of it is an impediment. But to get it only after that long and forced labor, and at the cost of lost liberty, this, I feel, is a sacrifice of ends to means. What is the use of the open door to the birds so long caged that the power of flight has gone? The drudgery of business make men other than they are. The hard work is simply the refuge of people who have nothing better to do. No, action is boring, but acting, I love acting. It is so much more real than life. Besides, being natural is such a difficult pose to keep up. Also, actors are so much more fortunate than real people. They can choose whether they will perform in comedy or tragedy, whether they will suffer or make merry, laugh or shed tears. But in real life, things are rather different. Most people are forced to perform parts for which they have no qualifications whatsoever. Our Poloniuses have to play Hamlet for us, while our Hamlets have to jest like Prince Hal. The world is a stage, but the play is badly cast. Of course, there are drawbacks to being an actor. I once saw a play in which Herbert Beerbohm Tree appeared in pajamas. There followed the greatest sympathy for Mrs. Tree. The Americans are going around Paris with depressing industry, looking at everything and seeing nothing. America, America. I was there once, you know, for a lecture tour, lecturing, in fact, on aesthetics in America. However, despite foreboding, my tour of the eastern seaboard was wildly successful. When I landed, I had two secretaries, one for autographs and the other for locks of hair. Within the first 6 weeks, the first had died of writer's cramp, and the second was completely bald. I was asked by one of an endless line of reporters for details of my private life. I was forced to reply that I really wished I had one. A curious habit of the Americans is that of hero worship. However, they always seem to take their heroes from the criminal classes. I discovered a minor example of this in Texas. In a local production of Macbeth, the part of Lady Macbeth was played by a real-life murderess, whose name appeared on the posters, followed by the statement, 10 years penal servitude. Despite this artistic enthusiasm, of a kind did flourish. While I was in Kansas City, I received a telegram from a town called Griggsville. Will you come and lecture us on beauty? I sent a reply, also by telegram, begin by changing your name. However, I was not without opponents either. In Denver, I received a message that if I went to the town of Leadville, as I proposed to do, the harsher spirits there would be sure to shoot me or my traveling manager. I immediately wrote and told them that nothing they could possibly do to my traveling manager would intimidate me, and went. I spoke to the audience, consisting entirely of taciturn miners, about the early Florentines. And they slept as peacefully as if no crime had ever stained the ravines of their wild mountain home. I described to them the pictures of Botticelli. The name, which must have seemed like a new drink, roused them from their dreams. I read to them passages from the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, and he proved so popular that I was reproved by my listeners for not having brought him with me. I replied that he had been dead for some little while, which brought the response, "Oh, shot him!" So finally, I arrived in California. So infinitesimal did I find the knowledge of art west of the Rocky Mountains, that an art patron, one who in his time had been a successful gold prospector, actually sued the railway company for damages when the plaster replica of the Venus de Milo, which he had ordered from Paris, arrived minus the arms. What is even more surprising still is that he won the case and the damages. One wonders whether things are really better in England. In London, of course, there is a modicum of culture. But in the country, I used to visit friends in the country. They took me out to see nature once. Pleasant but rather superfluous thing, nature. For instance, at twilight, it does have a certain suggestive effect and is not without loveliness, but its chief use is to illustrate quotations from the poets. I turned for stimulation to the human aspects of country life. Again, woefully inadequate. Anybody can be moral in the country. There are no temptations there. People get up so early because they have so much to do, and go to bed so early because they have so little to talk about. There has not been a scandal in the neighborhood since the time of Queen Elizabeth, and consequently, they all fall asleep after dinner. They tend to compensate for this mental collapse by being desperately healthy. Frightful word, health. One knows so well the popular idea of it. The English country gentleman galloping after a fox, the unspeakable in full pursuit of the uneatable. The poor English, the only magical property they retain is the miraculous power to turn wine into water. I quite enjoy music. but I think I prefer Wagner. He is so loud that one can talk all the way through him with nobody minding. Right, well, I'd like to call a halt to the actual monologue just for a few minutes. Well, I talk about the prison conditions of the time. Now, of course, Oscar Wilde was life of comedy so much, but of course, his life also ended in huge tragedy as well. So I'd like to give you some idea of the prison conditions of the time. Now, Wilde was taken first to Newgate Prison, then to Holloway, and then to Pentonville. He was later to spend a further 5 months in Wandsworth Prison, and his last 18 months in Reading Jail. In a regime that was to last till 1948, prisoners were divided into 3 divisions. In the first division, a prisoner could wear his own clothes and have food sent in. In the second, he was allowed to write and receive extra visits, while the third division, to which Wilde was sentenced, was called hard labour. The first month of hard labour was designed to break the spirit of an incoming prisoner and consisted of spending 6 hours a day grinding flour on a treadmill. After each 20 minutes on the mill, the prisoners were allowed 5 minutes rest before continuing. On his first day, Oscar climbed 6,000 feet on this task. Wilde wrote in his ballad of Reading Jail, "We banged the tins and bawled the hymns and sweated on the mill." After 3 days, he collapsed and was moved to the infirmary. After the first month of hard labour, prisoners were taken off the mill and sent to work on tailoring, postbag making, or oakum picking. Wilde was employed on the latter task, which involved untwisting old rope to reuse the hemp. "We tore the tarry rope to shreds with blunt and bleeding nails." To destroy any sense of personal dignity, each prisoner had his head shaved and was given ill-fitting clothes marked with broad arrows. To disorientate a new prisoner, for the first fortnight, he was forced to sleep on a plank bed with no mattress, thus inflicting insomnia. To additionally weaken a prisoner's physical ability to resist, the prison food was of deliberately poor quality, doled out ounce by ounce and consisting of skilly, which was a sort of oatmeal porridge with bits of mouldy meat in it, and a small loaf. This diet soon induced nausea and diarrhea with accompanying hunger. Wilde, a much larger man than normal, he was about 6'3", suffered greatly from this minimal nutrition. In order to prevent prisoners communicating with each other by tapping, the sewage pipes were removed from the cells and replaced with slop buckets. As prisoners were locked into the cells from 5 p.m. until the following morning, the diarrhea often overflowed the bucket. On 3 occasions, warders vomited after encountering the stench of Wilde's cell. "Each narrow cell in which we dwell is a foul and dark latrine." 1 hour's exercise a day were allowed, with the prisoners walking in single file and forbidden to speak, together with daily attendance at chapel twice on Sundays. Whereas in the 20th century, solitary confinement became the ultimate sanction in jail, in Wilde's day, it was the norm. No prisoner was allowed to speak, and the prisoners were places of perpetual silence and solitude. Wilde and his fellow convicts wore caps with face flaps, which had to be lowered if they encountered one another in the corridors. No communication was allowed with the outside world for the first 3 months. Then each prisoner was allowed to write 4 letters a year and to receive 4 visits a year. These visits were restricted to 20 minutes in the presence of a warder, and with prisoner and visitor separated by wire. No pictures or books were allowed, and any request for pen and paper other than the standard annual 4 letters was refused. The slightest infringement of these rules were disciplined by the offender being locked into a darkened cell and fed on bread and water for a week or more. Wilde was punished in this way on several occasions. The strangest of the consequences of Wilde's imprisonment was that arguably the greatest talker that England has ever known was condemned to 2 years of total silence. This is Wilde's own description of his time in jail. I felt that I would easily triumph at the trial. The working classes were with me to a boy. Relying on my lawyer to misrepresent me, I felt confident, despite occasional setbacks. My brother Willie kept telling me that he was defending me all over London. My poor dear brother could compromise a steam engine. He is reported as telling one of my detractors that I did not have a bad character. In fact, you could trust me with a woman anywhere. Then came the verdict. It is what we fear that happens to us. All trials are trials for one's life, and 3 times was I tried. The first time I left the box to be arrested. The second time to pass into the house of detention. And the third time to pass into prison for 2 years. Jail was a nightmare, more horrible than anything I had ever dreamed of. From that first evening, when they made me undress before them and put on that livery of shame, the cell was appalling. I could hardly breathe in it, and the food turned my stomach. I could not eat for days and days. I lay on my plank bed and shivered all night long. After some days, I got so hungry that I had to eat a little and drink some of the liquid. Whether it was tea or gruel, I really don't know. Of course, as soon as I really ate anything, it produced violent diarrhea, and I was sick all day and all night. I grew weak and had wild delusions. It's the hunger that makes you weak. But the worst of it all was the inhumanity. What devilish creatures men are. I had never known anything about them. I had never dreamt of such cruelties. On November the 13th, 1895, I was taken down from London to Reading Jail. From 2 o'clock to 2:30 on that day, I had to stand on the centre platform of Clapham Junction, in convict dress and handcuffed, for all the world to look at. I had been taken from my hospital cell at Wandsworth Prison without a moment's notice. Of all possible objects, I was most grotesque. People laughed when they saw me. Each train as it came up swelled the crowd. Nothing could exceed their amusement, until, of course, they realized who I was. And then they laughed still more. For half an hour, I had to stand in the grey November rain, surrounded by a jeering mob. Then the jails themselves, those slow, timeless destroyers of men. It is not patience that you need in there, for patience is a virtue. It is apathy that you need. I was, in my absence, made a bankrupt. My wife changed her name and went abroad. All was lost. I bore up against everything with some stubbornness and much rebellion of nature, until I had absolutely nothing left in the world except my 2 small sons. I had lost my name, my position, my happiness, my freedom, my wealth. I was a prisoner and a pauper. But I had one beautiful thing left: their love. Suddenly a verdict was passed, barring me from ever seeing them again. It was a blow so appalling that I did not know what to do. That the law should decide and take it upon itself to decide that I am unfit to be with my children is something quite horrible to me. The disgrace of prison was as nothing in comparison. I envied the other men who trod the yard with me. I knew that their children would be waiting for them, would look for their coming, would be sweet to them. Misfortunes one can endure. They come from outside, to suffer for one's own faults. There is the sting of life. No variation has ever been made on that court order, and I have never seen them since. I sometimes get photographs of them in their school uniforms, and they look very, very sweet. I gradually grew to cope with prison. After a while, I used to help the warders with their newspaper competitions, and by the time I had left, I had vicariously won a silver tea service and a grand piano. Do you know one of the things that happen to people in prison? They're not allowed to read newspapers. On my final journey from Reading to Pentonville, one of the warders had a copy of the Daily Telegraph, and I asked permission to read it. This was, of course, refused. So I asked permission to read it upside down, and this they did consent to allow. So I read the Daily Telegraph upside down all the way and never enjoyed it so much. It's really the only way to read newspapers. Then, in 1897, I was released. One comes out of prison as sensitive as a child. People say that I must regret terribly. Well, no. To regret one's experiences is to arrest one's own development. I lived a life of pleasure to the full, as one should do everything that one does. Tired of being on the heights, I deliberately went to the depths in the search for new sensations. To me, reformations in morals are as meaningless and vulgar as reformations in theology. For Wilde to propose to become a better person is a piece of unscientific cant. To become a deeper person is the privilege of those who have suffered. And such, I hope, I have become. One can only write up, whatever happens to another happens to oneself. And should anybody ask what that inscription means, one can simply reply, Christ's heart and Shakespeare's brain. I had a range of choices when I came out of prison. Frank Harris told me that I'd have to choose between this world, the next world, and Australia. As reports of the next world and Australia were not especially encouraging, I decided to choose this world, but England was quite impossible to live in. I tried to have dinner at the Savile Club. As I walked in, there was this wave of hostility against me. I felt like a lion in a den of Daniels. So I came here to France. When we arrived in Dieppe, we put up at the Hotel Bonaparte under assumed names to prevent postmen from having fits. Reggie Turner stayed here under the name of Robert Ross, while Robbie Ross stayed here under the name of Reggie Turner. They wanted me to retire into privacy and work. Privacy? After 2 years in prison? I want to look at life, not become a monument for tourists. Robbie will keep lecturing me these days. At present, he is a sort of combination of the university extension scheme and the Reformation, but he is always a dear. He wrote to me recently suggesting that I remarry. I replied that I did not really like the idea, especially as I am almost engaged to an 18-year-old fisherman of quite extraordinary beauty. He wants me to write anything, even a pantomime. Well, I don't mind writing a pantomime. In fact, I'd write a pantomime tomorrow, if they'd let me dramatize the book of Revelations. Speaking of remarrying, Ernest Dowson also suggested that I took a more wholesome interest in the sexual line and advised a visit to the DF brothel. It was the first time in 10 years, and it will be the last. However, I've asked Ernest to spread the story all over England. It should entirely restore my character. I am reputed to be widely travelled, a fiction of the French newspapers. In fact, a Russian traveller has reported visiting a monastery in the Balkans, where he was shown a gold tooth by the monks reputed to be mine. I meant to have stayed there penniless and paid them off with it. I trust someday it should generate miracles. I have travelled a bit. In Rome, I received the papal blessing 7 times, as I had been suffering from milk poisoning. I had hoped to produce Salome, but nothing came of it. I scramble on somehow, hope to survive the season. After that, I feel like a modern-day Ulysses, travelling the world without the dreadful disadvantage of having a Penelope waiting at home for him. In Naples, I contemplated suicide. But the temptation left me and has not returned. Besides, you imagine spending your afterlife in Naples? The cooking's frightful. Anyway, suicide is simply the greatest compliment that one can pay to society. The tragedy of old age is not that one is old, but that one is still young. The secret of keeping one's youth is to retain an inordinate passion for pleasure. In fact, merely to repeat one's follies. Most people nowadays die of a sort of creeping common sense and realize when it is far too late that the only things that one never really regrets are one's mistakes. There is nothing like youth. The middle-aged are mortgaged to life. The old are in life's lumber room. But youth is the lord of life. To get it back, there is absolutely nothing I would not do. Absolutely nothing. Except get up early, take exercise, or be a useful member of society. I wrote when I did not know the meaning of life. Now that I know something of its meaning, I have nothing left to write. Life cannot be written. It can only be lived. I have lived. Why does one run to one's ruin? Why does destruction have such a fascination? Why, when one stands on the heights, must one throw oneself down? No one knows, but things are so. Surely there was a time I might have trod the sunlit heights, and from life's dissonance struck one clear chord to reach the ears of God. Is that time dead? Lo, with a little rod I did but touch the honey of romance. Must I lose a soul's inheritance? But strange that I was not told that the brain could hold in a tiny ivory cell God's heaven and hell. After I was sentenced to imprisonment, I was taken down a long, dreary corridor from the dock to the cells. Robbie Ross was waiting there, so that before the whole gaping crowd, whom an action so sweet and simple hushed into silence, he might gravely, raise his hat to me as, handcuffed and in convict dress, I passed him by. Men have gone to heaven for smaller things than that. When the last trumpet sounds, and we are all couched in our porphyry tombs, I shall turn to him and whisper, Robbie, Robbie, let us pretend that we do not hear it. Right, well, thanks very much. That's the end of the presentation, basically. Where are we? Oh, we've still got plenty of time, yeah. Now, I'd just like, if it's okay, Anthony, I'd like to put in an advert for, I have recently written a book on, a local book about Southing Green and the Magdala pub, which I think most people know about. It's also about Hampstead and about Belsize as well. It's like a tour around, but it's comedy, pure comedy. It's all the stories which I've heard over the years, and I've known the Magdala. I first went to the Magdala pub in 1968 and sat there for the next 50 years, reading stories. It's loads of fun. It's lots of fun, lots of stories, etc., etc. It's had some nice remarks about it, full of information served up in a bright, breezy, readable style that will make you glad you live around here. And that's from Michael Palin, and quite the best collection of history and anecdote about the area that I've read, a bedside must, and that's Piers Plowright, the sadly late Piers Plowright, very good friend of mine. At any rate, it's there, it costs £10, and all the profits, I promise you, all the profits go to the libraries, but unfortunately it's not actually Adshead Road, it's Keatsgrove. So sorry about that, but there we are. I hope you enjoyed it. It's on sale at Daunt's. I think it's on sale at Daunt's in Belsize, but definitely down at at Daunt's in Southing Green, at Keatsgrove Library, and also in the Magdala pub itself. They're selling it as well. So there we are. That's about it. Now, if I come back on screen, wherever we are, I can take some questions if you like. Okay.
Right, well, thank you so much, Neil. That was a splendid tour de force through, as you promised, both the comedy and tragedy of Oscar Wilde's life. So plenty of room for thought about many aspects there. I was going to ask you, what was it that originally attracted you to Oscar Wilde? You've now been living with this character for, is it some 40 years, something like that?
Yes, it is. Yes, absolutely. Well, it actually goes back to university. I enjoyed Wilde, as most people do. Important to being earnest, and the sense of humour. It was, I think it was Hesketh Pearson's biography, which was written about 1946, and it was so funny. I mean, it was a laugh a minute, really. And so I knew that. But then, basically, it was 79. It was 3 years after the great Michael McLearmore died. And of course, his one-man show had been around for 15 years. He'd run it. And so there was nobody actually doing Oscar at that time. And I got a spot at Edinburgh. And so I went up to do a fortnight show at the Edinburgh Festival. And after a rather rocky start, it did well. And I then took it to Dublin Festival to do even better. And then finally brought it into London at the King's Head Theatre, and it did extremely well down there. And that was it. And basically, it just kept on coming. I started taking it around the festivals and arts centres, etc., around Britain, until I'd almost sort of running out of Britain, really, by the end of the 80s. And so I started taking it abroad and launched all sorts of places. And Africa, Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe, two of them. India went very well. The States did well. But it also went some very odd spots. Uruguay, it did very well down there. Hong Kong, it's been around anyway. I just got into the habit of it, and I just kept on getting vague requests to keep doing it, and so I did.
And were you also pursuing a career in acting at the same time, or
not really? No, I was writing other shows which I franchised out.
Right.
I've always concentrated on Irish writers, and George Bernard Shaw. I wrote one called Shaw's Corner, which actually was a television show with Dermot Walsh, actually, who was a wonderful actor. Unfortunately, he's as well now.
Sure.
But and people like that, yeah. But I've always concentrated on solo shows, yeah, entirely. I have been in a couple of other things, but there are nothing in those.
Right, got some questions coming in the chat, but I just wanted to ask you in relation to the Irish origin of Oscar Wilde. In the extracts that you've chosen to use for your performance, there are a lot of acerbic comments about the English and the Americans. Did he have anything to say about the Irish, and if so, what?
No, he didn't actually. It was very bad of him, but no, he didn't. No, he was very much. He was actually, I suppose, well, very much an Irish Republican, really, because his mother was Speranza, who was quite a famous poet of the mid-Victorian age, and he was in America. He was actually introduced as the son of Speranza, not as Oscar Wilde at all. So he was very wrapped up with Irish nationalism in that time. Although he was not, I don't think he really took politics very seriously at all. But if it was anywhere, it would have been with Ireland. That's it. But no, as far as politics goes, he always said the Lord's temporal have nothing to say, the Lord's spiritual have nothing to say, and the House of Commons has nothing to say and says it. Anyway.
Do feel free, everybody, to put your comments in the chat. If anybody wants to say anything out loud, I mean, do use the hand-raising function and make yourself known that way. But if you just want to put the comments in the chat, I've got one from Rob, who says, "Thanks, Neil, that was delightful. Could I ask if you have ever considered writing a memoir of your experiences touring your Oscar Wilde show?"
Well, thank you, Rob. Surprise, surprise, yes. In fact, I've got about 4 volumes of it, but I can't stop writing the memoirs actually at the moment. I did a blog actually, which you can get if you go to oh Lord, what is it? I've got my own website now. It's called Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde. Sorry, I can't remember it offhand. Anyway, just look up Oscar Wilde, Neil Titley, and you'll find there's a website there. And it is on there, and it's basically the story of the foreign tours with photographs. So it's there are also, oh Lord, what else was there? There's one which is called Resting, which is not so much about the foreign tours, which was about England, but that is not out as a blog because I may have been getting a publisher for that. So, but the blog stuff is out there, but all the journals are out there. So, yeah, there's a lot of them actually. Yeah. So yes.
Right, Rob has kindly put a link to your website in the chat.
Oh, good. Right.
So, wildetheatre.co.uk.
That's it.
Yeah. Wants to know. Right.
Well, that's yes. Yeah. Sure. Yes. Yes, I think it is. Yes. Yeah. Yes, that's right. Okay. I'm not good at this sort of stuff. Okay.
Right. Can I just ask you, in terms of sort of creating an anthology and turning it into a show, where do you turn to for the various extracts? It all comes out like a seamless whole. Clearly, must have been obtained from various sources. How do you go about doing that?
Absolutely. Well, it's the same with all of the one-man shows. It's really, you have to research absolutely solidly. And the researching Bernard Shaw took 2 years, and I went through everything. It's a huge amount of work, but particularly Shaw. But Wilde wasn't so difficult because he didn't write anywhere near as much as Shaw did. And then, of course, it's going through the biographies and other people's comments about him. Fortunately, I mean, he had about 300 sort of friends, acquaintances, and enemies, and many of them wrote about him. So it's really some of the snippets which some of obviously in that script which you just heard, loads of it are pretty well known quips, but some of them aren't, and those are the bits of gold which you have to pan out of the river. It's and you can only do that by hard research. But of course, for the most stuff, De Profundis, his letter from jail was of course, a big source there. The plays themselves, of course, are filled with quips. And then once you've got all the material together, it's really you're just sort of knitting it together, finding out what works. And you really do have to do a couple of shows with very, very friendly audiences to find out what works. Rather very much as a stand-up comedian does, has to try out material first. And rather similar with this. I mean, one-man shows, solo shows really are a sort of halfway house between theatre and stand-up. And it's an interesting world, but I've always thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been great fun. It's been a very enjoyable life, really.
Renata writes, it was wonderful, thank you. I've also been admiring the flow and the art of managing to juxtapose the horror and the enjoyment in his life.
Thank you.
Yeah. And certainly very obvious at the end. I mean, the whole awful prison experiences and everything surrounding that really brings you back to earth after the humor with a horrible bump, really. And the thought that these practices were still going on into the 1940s and so on. And I don't suppose prison's a very pleasant place to be even now, but you know, the humiliation and so on. One thing I sort of was wondering about, and I'd never really sort of checked into myself actually, was why he decided that he wanted to take out this libel action, knowing that this might be a possible outcome, or did he not have a clue that this was a possible outcome?
It's so it's one of those extraordinary things. I mean, it's rather remarkably stupid thing to do, obviously. There were various reasons for it, and in fact, I've written an entire essay about 4 different reasons why he did it. But partially, of course, his boyfriend, Lord Alfred Douglas, Bosie Douglas, who incidentally lived in Hampstead up in Church Row for a time, he was goading Wilde on to attack his father because, of course, the Queens really loathed each other. And it was a family feud, and Wilde rather stupidly wandered into it and got mixed up in the whole thing. It's the other side of it. There was all sorts of psychological things in it. This very fact about you were saying earlier about Irish republicanism, the fact that in Ireland at the time to go to jail was not a sign of moral propinquity. It was because patriots went to jail. As Wilde said himself, a patriot goes to jail for loving his country, a poet goes to jail for loving his boys. And he felt that his father had been at the centre of a great scandalous trial back in Dublin earlier on. It was seen almost, he thought he was going to be a bit like John Bunyan. He could go to jail and he could be able to write Pilgrim's Progress in there. And of course he was wrong, thoroughly wrong. Unfortunately, he did some, he was on, he was in jail for about 3 weeks beforehand on remand. And the conditions were very good, extremely good if you're on remand. He had his own food in there and clothes. He had as many visitors as he wanted, and books, etc., etc. And he thought, well, that's okay, we can go along with this. And that is one of the reasons why he never escaped, because he had certainly had the opportunity. The authorities really did not want to go ahead with the whole prosecution. And they certainly didn't want to go with sentencing him because it was a bit too embarrassing for the government of the time. There were ramifications which I won't go into because it's such a lengthy subject and a tricky subject as well. But he was allowed 3 weeks in which he could have escaped from Britain quite easily. Frank Harris, his friend, had a yacht down at Gravesend in the estuary waiting to take him away, and he refused to run. Partly, an Irish gentleman does not run, as his brother said. There was that side of it. He was in love as well. I think that's I found somewhere a quote, the secret of the medieval troubadours was that a romantic love is a concealed death wish. Don't know, rather heavy line to take, but I think there possibly was a moment of that. It's, also, he believed in the fate, and he went to palm readers, etc. And he actually believed in this palm reader who said he would triumph at the trial, which was another one in the eye for on that line. So there's quite a lot of other reasons around, but as I say, I'm unfortunately I haven't got 14 points in front of me. But
could you say something about the role of Edward Carson in the trial?
Well,
perhaps a bit about Carson's background, in case anybody doesn't know who he was.
Edward Carson, he was a remarkable, extremely famous lawyer. He was the man actually who, I don't know if anybody knows the Winslow boy case, which was Terence Rattigan play. It was about his defense of a naval cadet accused of stealing a 5-shilling postal order. And it's a famous play. And at any rate, he was actually the lawyer involved in that whole, in the original case. But Carson knew Wilde when they were children. Down in Dungarvan, they used to go on holidays. 2 families used to go on holidays. Michael Beck-Learmore said that the later affairs must have been because Oscar must have kicked over Carson's sandcastle at some point and causing problems later on. They were at Trinity College Dublin together. They knew each other there. They didn't get on terribly well, but they knew each other. The point about when it came to the big case, Carson was a very smart character indeed, and so was Wilde. But Carson knew the law better, and he, on the first couple of days of the trial, when Wilde was giving evidence on the first day, he allowed Wilde to flow, to beat him hands down. He allowed Wilde to become over self-confident. Because Wilde could always beat him on literary quotes and things like that, and wit as well. But then he suddenly attacked and led Wilde into saying that Wilde said the boy was no, heavens above, no, of course I would not have had any relationships with this boy. He was particularly ugly. Wham! And Carson came in like a ton of bricks. Is that the reason why you did not take him up? And of course, the whole thing, the case collapsed after that. Wilde knew he was dead. And so Carson used his forensic skills to destroy Wilde's case. However, having said that, later, of course, it went on to 3 trials. The first trial was Oscar suing Queensberry, and then there were 2 trials which were on Wilde himself. And the thing about that was that Carson refused to take up the prosecution on those 2 later cases. He said the Wilde had suffered enough by his reputation, etc. So he was not vindictive about the whole thing at all. So Carson.
And Carson goes on to be a major political figure.
He did indeed. Yes, of course. You know, the whole thing with Ulster, he was one of the prime movers in the separation of Northern Ireland from the Republic. Very much so, yeah. He was the one who brought the guns into the north to arm the Ulster Volunteer Force of the time, and he was. It was said that there was, well, it certainly did lead to a civil war in Ireland. It could possibly even, it was suggested, even more sort of civil war in England as well. But it was thought it was more war to the knife and fork. It was said it was to the party stuff. But it was certainly serious. I mean, there's no doubt about that. It was only really the First World War which stopped that happening, and Ireland came together with, and particularly Ulster came together with the rest of Britain to fight the Germans. And famously, the Ulster Brigade mostly died at the Somme. They were the original Ulster Volunteer Force. So Carson's men, and they were the private army.
Now, there's a question from Tracy, which has really got 3 parts to it. So I'll read it all, and then we can you can decide which ones you want to take first. I think they're in order. So the question, the first is, what was his literary reputation in England before the trials? The second, which leads on from that, was, had the plays been performed in the West End? And then thirdly, was there any public opinion in support of him, presumably at the time of the trial.
Oh, at the trial, I see. Yeah.
I assume, because I assume that he was popular before, and in terms of his literary work, but perhaps you could just comment on that first. So it's his literary reputation, and then about whether these plays, and you mentioned, you know, this golden year for him in which the importance of being earnest and the Ideal Husband both came out, so on. And did they hit the West End stage?
Yeah. Well, before that, essentially, no. He was a bit of a sort of literary flippity-gibbet. He had written a couple of plays which were quite frankly awful, and he acknowledged those back in when he was about in his early 20s. He really wanted to be a poet, and his poetry is divided really into the Swinburne and water concept, which somebody described it as his poetry. But of course, and then later he wrote The Ballad of Reading Gaol, which is an entirely different style, totally unlike Wilde ever wrote at all. It was very, very realistic. He said it was Kipling. But generally speaking, he was a journalist. He was a critic on mostly on theatre and also on art. But he was a sort of journalist gadabout who flipped around. He was the editor of the Woman's World for quite a long time and did it very well. He was a very good editor, except just got bored with it towards the end. So up until about 1889, he was not really a major figure at all in literature. Then he wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, which was a big hit, well, sort of hit, success of scandal, I think. And then he really, for money, he was thinking about it, and he thought, right, I am popular at dinner tables. I am a huge figure in society, but I'm not particularly well known outside of society at that time. Why don't I put my quips, which work so well at the dinner table, don't I put them on stage, which is he did. And the first three plays are very much in the Victorian melodrama style, but with added wit. And they were very, very successful indeed. He became a huge figure in theatrical London, and also in New York. Of course, he was big in the States as well. So then he, of course, he came up with Importance of Being Earnest, which was a huge success and still remains one of the glories of English literature. So that is the situation. So he was very much well known in the West End, and he made a lot of money out of it as well, which he dribbled away mostly in the Café Royal. When he came to the trials, no, there wasn't that much support, because essentially I think people were shocked by the crime which he was accused and convicted. It was certainly not a popular topic in those days. I think when he failed in his case against Queensberry, they said the prostitutes danced in the street outside the court because of triumphing over their rivals in the Red Boy stakes. And once it got going, once he was convicted, it was absolute avalanche of attack on him. The only thing you can really compare it to is possibly now Jimmy Savile, the situation there. Very similar sort of reaction to Wilde at the time. It's an extraordinary thing between 1895, when the trial was, and 1911. There was no male child, no child at all, with the name of Oscar. Gives you some idea of the shock horror which was around.
No equivalent of J'accuse.
No, certainly not. No. In fact, Zola was not particularly approving either.
No. Right. Just a comment from Vanessa, who says, "Thank you, Neil. It was particularly interesting to be reminded about the prison conditions and Oscar's words about them, beautifully performed."
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So I don't know if anybody else has any other questions that they would like to ask. I was going to ask you actually, I mean, there've been a number of film interpretations of Oscar Wilde, and I particularly remember, I mean, years ago, Peter Finch, I think it was, in the Trials of Oscar Wilde, and others since. I imagine you've probably seen everything that's ever come out. Are there any that you particularly recommend, or any that you feel were sort of traduced the subject?
Yeah. Yes, it's a tricky one because I've seen some wonderful theatrical performances as well. One of my favorites, although it didn't do terribly well at the box office or with the critics, but that was Liam Neeson's Wilde in the first version of The Judas Tree by David Hare. Yes. And which later became was a big hit in the West End for Rupert Everett not so long ago. And of course, which was then developed into his film The Happy Prince, which was only about 4 years ago. My own, well, of course, it was Robert Morley, who was a huge supporter of Wilde, and rather Wilde's reputation. And he fought to get Wilde back into the mainstream of English literature. And in 1960, the two films about Wilde came out in the same week. I mean, you wait 60 years for a film about Wilde, and then you get two in the same week. So you got Robert Morley, but the dear old Robert Morley was a lovely fellow. But the trouble was, it's not really Oscar Wilde; it's Robert Morley playing Oscar Wilde. The one I like, actually, I think of a lot, is possibly Peter Finch. I think that was a very good film. I think it did well. I think Lionel Jeffries as Queensberry was remarkably good. Jonathan Glazer was very good as Percy Douglas. I think actually that's possibly my favourite. But Stephen Fry, of course, did a grand job there. But the problem with the Fry film, I think, as I said at the start, it's a Greek tragedy, and I think with a Greek tragedy, you start at the top and you end at the bottom. Now, what I felt about it, it's not Stephen Fry's fault, it was the script, I felt, was that it didn't start at the top, it started about midway. And so it was a Victorian paterfamilias situation who fell, but not all that far, and just had that far to come. And I felt it was sort of slightly a bit of anticlimax about that film, I found. Rupert Everett was an extraordinary film. He'd spent 10 years fighting to get that thing through. It was a remarkable tribute to him. It's also it's a fascinating area. Those final years of Wilde's life are very, very interesting indeed. There's one short story which I really have to tell about, though. The thing about Everett's film is the death of Wilde. And what happened there was that it's a very Catholic film in that sense. And what happened was that Oscar was on his deathbed. He couldn't move, or barely move. He couldn't speak at all. And Robert Ross, who was a recent Catholic convert, asked Oscar if he wanted to die in the faith. And Oscar raised his hand like that. And Robert Ross said, yes, okay. So he went off, got a Catholic priest, came back, did the honors, and last rites, etc., etc., etc. And Oscar died in the faith. The thing was that there was also in that room was Reggie Turner. Now Reggie, excuse me, Reggie wrote an autobiography which came out a few years later and seemed to have disappeared into the ether. But what he wrote was that what actually happened was when Robbie Ross asked Oscar if he wanted to become a Catholic, die as a Catholic, Oscar raised his hand like that. But what he was actually trying to do was to reach for his cigarettes. So it's probably possible that Oscar Wilde became a Catholic by accident. If Rupert Everett had found that Reggie Turner story as well, it would have made a much more interesting end to the film and a gloriously comic end to the end to the film as well. But he didn't, so there we are. But no, if I had to choose one, I go Peter Finch. I would. Yeah.
Right. Oh well, I'm pleased about that. I seem to remember. I mean, it's a long time ago, that it was quite a controversial thing to put it on at the time. I mean,
it was, yes.
yes, yeah,
Well, as I say, prior to that, almost nothing. There was
yeah,
still very,
yeah.
very
Mm,
some very nasty biographies still being written in the 1950s. St.
yeah,
John Owen was, he wrote a particularly nasty one about Wilde. But then 1960 was the year that everything changed, and you had the two films came out, and also the Michael McLemore's Say Show, and that, of course, those three things changed. Things through the 60s, things changed hugely. Whole attitudes, of course, for homosexuality was legalized for a huge thing then, and possibly Wilde had something. What had happened to Wilde had some bearing on that. I don't know, maybe. And that was that. And then sort of since then, I mean, now, from somebody who was almost, pretty much banned, now the Vatican has issued, a few years ago, the Vatican issued a book of Oscar Wilde quotes for Catholics. So
right,
he's gone from jail to sanctification, and
right,
only taken him 100 years.
right. Well, in the in the life of the church, was pretty quick, actually.
Exactly.
So, anyway, I think probably this is a point at which to bring things to a conclusion. And thank you very much. I hope that we'll be able to get you back at some point to talk on Under Ken Wood, perhaps when we're back live in the library.
Sure.
It would be very grateful to see you. In the meantime, of course, I would encourage people to go out and buy the book, and it will result in money going to a good cause, which is Keats Library. But equally, if you feel that you can give a small donation to Belsize Community Library, I put the link in the chat again. I'll just put it up. And if you click on the link in the chat, that'll take you to the Winch's website, where you can contribute directly to Belsize Community Library. That would be very nice if you can do that. So thank you very much, Neil. Thank you to the audience, and I hope we will get you back before too long.
Hope so. Okay, good luck with the library as well.
Right, thank you. Good night, everyone.
Goodbye.
Good night.